Webinar. My name is Jeff Rathke. I'm the president of the American German Institute at Johns Hopkins University. And this is a very timely session in my view, and I'm so pleased we're able to put it on. We are 2.5 weeks from the German federal election, which is happening on February 23rd. The German election is the most important election in the world in 2025. And so the trends in German politics, the likely outcomes, and the issues that are at stake are especially important, not only in the transatlantic relationship, but more generally. And so we have with us today a couple of Germany's leading public opinion researchers to shed some light on this. I'm going to hand things over in a moment to my colleague, Dr. Eric Langenbacher, who is the director of our program on society, culture, and politics here at AGI. But maybe just a word once again about the stakes. The German coalition collapsed 3 months ago, and we are now in what has been a slow motion snap election cycle. Chancellor Scholz has had no working majority since November 6th. And we see also the ways in which this is influencing German politics with a strengthening far right and a growing and contentious debate about the degree to which one can work with or use the votes of the far right on issues like migration. So all of these things are going to be crucial in the election campaign that remains ahead of us. And with that, I'm going to step back, let Eric take us forward, and I am really excited to hear what our guests have to say today. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Jeff. It's really my great pleasure to briefly introduce our two speakers this morning or this afternoon, depending on where you're zooming in from. We're going to hear first from Yvonne Schroth, who's the managing director of Forschungsgruppe Wahlen. She's produced numerous publications that cover electoral research and survey research methods. She studied sociology and educational science at the University of Heidelberg, where she also completed a PhD at the Institute of Sociology back in 1999. She's been with Forschungsgruppe Wahlen for many years now, becoming a member of the board in 2007. And I should also point out that she also produces the 6 p.m. forecast and projections for the television broadcaster ZDF. Then we'll hear from Peter Matuschek, who's the director of research at the Forsa Institute in Berlin. Since 2007, he's been responsible for a variety of research projects on elections, public opinion, on all levels of the political system, as well as reporting on polling results and consulting. Before joining Forsa, he worked for the Center for European and North American Studies in Göttingen, the University of Potsdam, and the Mannheim Center for European Social Research. He also holds a PhD from the University of Göttingen. So welcome. There's so much that we'll get into today. Last week was an especially dramatic week in German politics. I was quipping before that it was even more dramatic than what's going on in Washington, D.C. for a change. That was because of the AfD voting with the CDU on a rather harsh reform to the asylum and immigration rules in Germany. I think that we're all keen to hear your thoughts on how that's going to affect the election and the support for the various parties. But without further ado, Yvonne, the floor is yours.
So thank you so much, Eric and Jeff, for having me again. Let me start with showing the political mood during the Ampel coalition. The background to the failure of the Ampel coalition was explained and discussed in detail at the last webinar. The red arrow is the point the government collapsed, and the other two arrows are key points in time when the political mood shifted. These 2 points in time are described by the terms of Gaspreisbremse. I would translate it with gas price break, and there was the time of the highest inflation in Germany. And the second point is described as Heizungsgesetz, heating law. We see how much the SPD, the FDP, and the Greens, the 3 Ampel parties, losing support over time. The simultaneous rise of the AfD is mostly also an expression of how dissatisfied the population was in the government at the time. But what we see above all, is that there have been hardly any changes for a year in the polls. There has been only a little shift when the BSW, the Alliance Sarah Wagenknecht, was founded in January 24. The AfD lost some of its support. Since the Ampel failed, the BSF, the AfD, remained constant at 21%. Since the collapse of the coalition, and even before, we can therefore speak of stagnation of the polls. The AfD ratings in the East are twice as high as in the West. This also applies to the BSW values. The opposite case is for the Greens, who are twice as high in the West than in the East. But the AfD is on track to double their seats compared to 21. The reasons for the two shifts, the two arrows, very briefly described. As soon as the Ampel were in office, their actions were determined by reacting to the war and Putin. They had to make sure there was enough gas for the winter, etc. And they failed to communicate the measures which were very expensive for the people, but were consequences of the war. Scholz, in particular, should have responded more to people's worries and fears when inflation was very high. All of this and constant internal controversies led to the fact that the Ampel has the lowest satisfaction rate ever measured. The three parties have also lost a lot of support and trust, and they have not recovered since. The fact that nothing has changed in the political mood over a year for so long is, of course, also an expression of the fact that CDU-CSU with Friedrich Merz does not appear to be a competent alternative. It would be so easy because of so much people are so fed up with the Ampel. So it is not clear if the three small parties, FDP, Linke, and BSW, make it into the Bundestag, and it's not really predictable. So myself, I think the Linke will make it. If they make it into the Bundestag, then there will be 7 parties, if we count CDU and CSU as one parliamentary group. And if all 3 do not make it, there will only be 4 parties. At this time, in this week, about 40% are not yet sure who they will vote for or whether they will vote at all. The key question now, as Eric mentioned, is, however, how the Merz-AfD drama in the Bundestag last week affect the election campaign and the political mood. We will publish our new poll tomorrow, but we see only little movements in the political mood, really little movements. And Peter will tell us later what's up at their polls. To Merz, I'll come later, and Peter will also let us know how Merz is rated after last week. This is our recent projection. So we see the Linke is at 5% and FDP and BSW are just under the 5% threshold. Here is the rating of the Chancellor's work. Since the time of the Heizungsgesetz, his work has no longer been rated well by the majority. More than 60% say that he does a rather poor job. It is pure speculation whether the SPD would be better off with Boris Pistorius. Olaf Scholz said at the beginning of his chancellorship, if you demand leadership, you will get leadership. But it was exactly this leadership that was lacking throughout his time as chancellor. During the controversies within the coalition, he was seen as weak and not sufficiently enforceable. Here are the ratings of the candidates over 20 years, shortly before the election. And the values are means on a scale of +5 to -5 to +5, shortly before the election. And you see in 2025, never before have all candidates been so unpopular than now. Olaf Scholz was rated much more positively in 2021, 1.6 as a mean, and he's now rated much lower. Merz and Habeck do not have positive means either. In 2021, Olaf Scholz ran without any previous experience. Now he enters the race with a really poor record. Habeck also not have a good assessment of his work, and Scholz and Habeck face voters with a lot of ballast of the Ampel. So we see the three party candidates are not convincing in any way. Here are the ratings of the candidates in the two parts of Germany. Red is west and blue is east, and no one achieves a positive mean. Scholz and Merz are even worse in the east than in the west. Habeck is significantly worse in the east, and the difference in Weidel's ratings is striking. So Weidel is the only candidate who is rated better in the east. Whom do you want as chancellor? So no wonder none of the candidates is outstanding when it comes to this question of who you want as chancellor. And we see that Scholz and Habeck have a history. Only 20% want Scholz and 30% Friedrich Merz. But this is not an outstanding value. Who is suitable for Bundeskanzler, Bundeskanzlerin? No one of them has a majority in this question. And this is truly, I think, shameful. So here we can see again that the party's candidates are not convincing. Only 27% attest to the incumbent chancellor's suitability for the office, but his challengers are not really better off. So we see that also Merz has really a problem. The ratings of the parties. All the three parties involved in the Ampel have lost a lot of reputation and trust in comparison to 2021. CDU, CSU as well is rated worse than 2021, but it's the only party to make it just above zero, as we see, 0.2. Friedrich Merz is rated more negatively than his party, and actually the candidate should give the party a push, but this is definitely not the case. But Olaf Scholz is also rated worse than his party. The AfD is the only party which is rated significantly better, and that is a catastrophic sign. The ranking of the parties, the rating of the parties in the two parts of Germany, the SPD and CDU just make it to positive means in the West. The Greens and the FDP are rated much worse in the West, as we can see. The opposite case is by the AfD and the BSW, who are rated significantly better in the East. So what we see is, therefore, the parties and the candidates are judged very differently in the two parts of Germany. So 35 years after the reunification of Germany, we will have again and still very different election results in the two parts of the country. The rating of the coalition models. The CDU-CSU have ruled out a coalition with the AfD, like the other parties as well, the so-called Brandmauer, firewall. And this option, CDU-CSU and AfD, is also mainly welcomed by AfD voters, not by CDU-CSU voters. And only 19% want this option. But as you can see, no coalition is wanted by a majority. The only thing that is clear is that a large majority does not want a repeat of the traffic light of the Ampel, quite apart from the fact that this will not happen. There are actually only two possible coalition alternatives, CDU-CSU with the SPD, 33% find this good, and the other option is CDU-CSU with the Greens, but both alternatives are not approved. And a cooperation with the CDU-CSU has not become any easier for the SPD and the Greens after last week. Which issue is most important for your voting decision? So migration and the weak economy are perceived as the two main problems in Germany for over 2 years. But when asked what the most important issues are for the personal voting decision, by the most important personal election themes, migration is not in the first place, but in the fourth place. And it's mainly mentioned by AfD voters. In the first place is peace and security, closely followed by economy and social justice. So in respect, Friedrich Merz may have backed the wrong horse when he bought his proposals for stricter asylum law in the Bundestag with the votes of the AfD. This brings us to the drama in the Bundestag last week, as Eric mentioned, and I don't read it because Eric said the important things, and Peter will go into this in more detail, but let me mention a few things. What was put to the vote has no effect on migration policy. It had no need to, it was no need to do this. It was a display of Merz, we will do it differently. And at the same time, the AfD was treated like a normal party. So in my opinion, last Wednesday was a moral disgrace for Germany. And Merz accepted this and orchestrated it. And at the party convention from the CDU last weekend, Merz had the party's backing. We asked last week how the voters think about it. And as we see, the country is divided over the Bundestag's approach. 47% thought the vote with the AfD was good. 48% thought it was wrong. The majority of the CDU, CSU, FDP, AfD, and BSW supporters thought it was good. We have solid two political camps. The voters are polarized. So the question marks are there any effects of Merz breaking the taboo? Effects of the election campaign and the election outcome? Still stagnation in the polls? I say in this week, yes, we have still stagnation in the polls. But what happened after Wednesday, and then I come to the end, Merz tried to put a highly emotional topic at the center of the election campaign, but I think his strategy did not work. Firstly, by voting with the AfD in the Bundestag, he has turned the AfD into a normal party. He has focused on an issue that mobilizes only AfD supporters. The rest of the population is worried about whether they can buy cheaply food, whether they can find apartments with a rent they can afford, whether their job is secure. These are the issues that concern people and affect people's lives. Merz should have focused on the economic competence of his parties, because these are also the issues that mobilize and drive people. All that Merz did was mobilize, protest, and divide the country. So the election campaign is now focused on that the democratic parties fighting each other instead of fighting together against the AfD. So I will come to an end and summarize. A large majority has been dissatisfied with the coalition and Olaf Scholz since middle of 2022. And this dissatisfaction remains high. The stagnation in the polls is an expression of helplessness and perplexity in the face of the unattractive personal offer of the SPD, CDU, CSU, and Greens. With a popular candidate, the CDU-CSU would have the potential for, I think, 40%, because people are so fed up with the three Ampel parties. Despite last week, Merz will still have to choose between two coalition partners, SPD and Greens, but that's more difficult now. Thank you.
Thank you. That was extremely informative. Peter, the floor is now yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Yvonne, for starting this intervention. I would like to start again with the voting preferences, but not going so much back as you did, but stressing once more for a second the high degree of stability. If we look at the evolution in 2024, starting from January, where we only saw very minor variations, and with all the aspects you have mentioned. And the striking point is, as you already said, with the Ampel coalition parties, Social Democrats, Greens, and Liberals losing about 15 to 17 percentage points compared to their election result in 2021. Why is it that the Christian Democrats haven't benefited more from this disastrous coalition record? And the question, of course, is now whether, and this remains to be seen in this week and the two coming weeks, what effect the drama of the AfD vote last week will have. But I think we can still say that the Christian Democrats will come out as the largest party by far. So one aspect I would like to mention, why the Christian Democrats aren't doing better before coming to their candidate. And there's one question we're asking every week, which goes about party competence. So we're always asking, which party do you think is most capable of solving or tackling the problems in the country? An overall competence question, not related to special policy areas. And interestingly, when we compare the results 3 weeks before the last election with the results of this week, it's a very, very similar picture, with only very low ratings for the Social Democrats, the Greens, less than 10% think that one of these parties is most suited to solve the problems in the country, and only 16%, which is the same number as we had 4 years ago, for the Christian Democrats. So this is, if you look at these figures in a much broader perspective, we had the Christian Democrats with this question at 30%, 40%, even 50% during the COVID crisis, of people who said this was the party best suited to solve the problems in the country. So the Christian Democrats had already lost this, let's call it, comparative advantage to the Social Democrats and the other parties 4 years ago. And what the party has not managed to achieve in the 3 or 4 years is to widen this gap again, as they were able to do in previous years, not only with during the chancellorship of Angela Merkel, but even before. So this is a very disastrous result for a party who had 4 years time to consolidate as the alternative, the major opposition party. And as usually, half of the electorate says no party is able to do this. Only minor variations with those who nowadays even say, well, some of them, the AfD would be best suited, or but not a very large number. So the second factor, of course, is the candidate. Yvonne already talked about Merz's rating, so I just decided to show some figures. We had just polled last week, and the last time we did so was in August 2024, which is like a characteristic profile of Friedrich Merz. So we have been asking some attributes. So he's doing well only on one or two aspects, which is intelligible, outspoken, 60% or now 65%. The only attribute he has improved a little bit. Strong leader, second, more or less the same as in August. He has lost some points on the issue of competence compared to August. Knows about people's concerns. He has gained a little bit, but especially on the attributes trustworthiness and likability, where he was always quite weakest. He has lost 6 and even 8 percentage points compared to August. So this was came right after the last Wednesday's vote. And this is in a way one reason to explain one aspect which explains this position the Christian Democratic Party is in, that the Merz is a candidate who does not really connect with large parts of the electorate, especially as he has special problems among younger voters, women, urban areas, and especially the center voters who had backed the party even in the last election when Merkel ran in 2017 with all the problems they already had. But this is a real problem, and this is why Merz is not an asset for the party, but rather a liability. Just one thing about the decision of Merz to take this vote, this resolution to the Bundestag and vote together with the AfD. We had similar results in the poll we did last week as Yvonne had with the Forschungsgruppe, a very tiny, very narrow result, almost equally split. When we asked this again at the beginning of end of last week and this Monday, we had a little bit more clearer result, with the majority saying that relying on the AfD votes for passing this resolution on migration policy was not the right decision. But exactly as Yvonne said, we have a split between the voters of the CDU-CSU, although 1/3 does not back this decision, and with the FDP voters and the AfD voters, especially the AfD voters, much in favor of it, of course, and also the voters of the BSW, but the SPD, Green, and Left Party supporters strongly against it. And interestingly, we just had a look at the undecided voters who are strongly against this move of Merz of passing this resolution. So we also asked the question in this poll this week if forming a government with the SPD or the Greens would turn out difficult, if Merz would build a coalition together with the AfD, which is something he denies. But as we can see, 4 of 10 Germans do not trust him, and only the supporters of the CDU-CSU and the liberals think that he will keep his word. On the other, and the SPD voters are equally split on this issue. So what really has happened is now that the distrust has risen vis-a-vis Merz and his move with the AfD last week. Sorry for doubling this, but we also asked this question just some days ago about what are the most important issues for your vote when voting, and we repeated this question from last October. And interestingly, we have a very similar pattern as Yvonne just showed, and the most striking thing is that migration is not one of the top priorities for people. It's even the second last in our rating, only followed by climate and environment protection. The most important issues we also had asked for: protecting democracy, coping with right-wing extremism, which is the most important issue. Then comes economic situation and internal security, crime, national security. So a very similar picture as Yvonne showed, and this also leads me to really question the strategic capabilities of, well, not only the CDU but other parties when talking about their campaigns and planning the campaigns, with these results, which are very clear that migration is not the most important issue. Of course, when we ask which measures should be applied, should there be more measures against illegal migration, we always have a majority, which we always also have when we ask about climate protection. But the decisive point is that it's not the most important issue, and by elevating it to such, Merz, the only thing he achieved was to play the most important issue for AfD voters, but alienating or running the risk of alienating all the other voters who think that there are many more issues which are much more important than migration. So just one short simulation, and it is pretty clear that the outcome of the future parliament will depend on very few percentage points, will depend on whether the smaller parties, the Liberals, BSW, the Left Party, will make it into the Bundestag or not. So if one other party makes it into the Bundestag, all the picture will change and will make it much more difficult to form a coalition. This is only based on our last poll, which sees 5 parties in the parliament with the strength we have measured. And with this seat distribution, there would still be a possibility for the Christian Democrats to form either a coalition with the Social Democrats or the Greens. And they would not have to rely on the 3-party coalition, but with minor changes, all the picture might change, and Merz would face a situation where he would have to choose 2 partners instead of 1. Just to finish, one last point, we also asked last week one question of what voters thought compared to previous elections, if the decision who to vote for is easier in this election than in previous election or more difficult. And what we see is almost exactly the same figure as Yvonne told us about the undecided. 41% say they feel it is more difficult than in previous elections to make up their decision. And this is a consequence, of course, of the situation we have with the disaffection with the incumbent government parties and the lack of credibility of the major opposition party, which leads to I would say, a similar desperation of people from the political center as 4 years ago, where we always also had quite not so attractive candidates and a difficult situation. Now we have the opposite constellation, but voters being confronted with a similarly tough choice. Thank you.
All right, thank you, both of you, for such rich and insightful presentations. I would ask our participants, our attendees, if you have any questions, if you could please type them into the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and then I'll read off the questions, maybe combining some to our panelists. But while everybody does that, I have a couple of questions myself. So perhaps most obviously, both of you kind of indicated that it's very difficult to predict how the 3 small parties will fare. But Yvonne, I think you said that the left will probably make it in, and Peter, you also indicated as much as well. But I remember not that long ago, the left seemed to be in their death throes, polling at about 3%. Now they seem to be over the 5%. So in your opinion, what accounts for the partial recovery of the left party?
I can start. There is one point that that the BSW, who is a part of the left party, has now lost a lot of attention. The BSW was at 8% in September after the three Eastern elections, and meanwhile the Linke was at 2 or 3%, and now the BSW has lost a lot of attention while the coalition collapsed. And I think the Linke could be an alternative, and I see in our polls even for young people to vote for, because we have this polarization, and I think between the two party camps there is no movement. So I think between the SPD and the Greens, the Linke will be a new alternative, probably for young voters in the West.
Yeah, I totally agree with this. This is the same what we are seeing among Greens, among younger people in urban areas. And I mean, what was seen as a disadvantage when the party split up with the foundation of the BSW now might be a chance, because the left party, the rest of it, is now more pure in its ideological views. I mean, they are campaigning with typical leftist issues, you know, taxing the rich, but without those prejudices that Wagenknecht is promoting against migration and so on. So they can make a much more purer campaign than they could before, and with a change of leadership and to one rather young candidate, they might be attractive for some segments of the electorate now. Yeah.
All right, we have quite a few questions to kind of get through. One of the biggest questions has to do with the issue of underestimating the support for the AfD. I think this has been a problem in other electoral cycles. Certainly it's been a problem in other countries, first and foremost this country, with Trump voters being underestimated in quite a bit of polling. So do you think that the support for the AfD is not fully being captured with your samples? Or what measures have you taken to ensure that this doesn't happen again?
So that the AfD is underestimated in our surveys is clear for years, and Forza and we use strict random samples. So you have to make a difference if you use a strict random sample or if you use online surveys which are based on reverse sampling and self-recruited participants. But in our polls, we know that the AfD is underestimated, especially because the ZDF is Lügenpresse. So we are part of this media which they do not trust. So, but we have found, we know how to deal with this underestimation. And on the other side, we use 3 interview modes, landline, mobile, and SMS-based online frames. So we have three frames, and the AfD underestimation depends on the interview mode, and whether the interview is based on conversation, or if the answer or if the questions are answered anonymously. So you reach other people in these different survey modes, and the AfD underestimation is really different in these 3 frames. But as you see, when it comes to election, that we can now deal with it. So it is known that the Greens are overestimated in surveys. So you can deal with it with the biases.
All right, we have a couple of questions about the impact of Elon Musk and his interventions in German politics, particularly his strong endorsement of the AfD. And then related to that, is there a Trump effect? Is the second administration of Donald Trump having any kind of impact on German voters, on public opinion?
Maybe I could step in. I mean, with Elon Musk, that's an interesting question, and I simply do not know. But what I do know is that if you look at his interventions with the AfD, his talk with Alice Weidel, and so on X, I would say in general terms that the effect of Musk does not depend so much on what he does or what the AfD does, but much more on what the other parties do, or what the let's say the established media outlets are doing. I mean, if you look at the numbers who followed this chat with Weidel, between Musk and Weidel, I think it was 200,000. But it was the second issue, apart from the wildfires in California, on the first channel of the German television. So what we see is, what I see is a certain pattern we had in previous years, that what he's doing are being reported by the traditional media. The other parties react to what Weidel says or does not say, and there is a very tremendous priming effect with the appearances of the leading figures of the party. So if there is any effect of Musk's interventions, it would be through would be rather indirect, I would say.
Yvonne, do you want to add anything? Nope, you're good. Okay. So next we have a question about the last weeks of the campaign. Do you usually see any major shifts in preferences over this final kind of stretch, or do you think that things are pretty kind of locked in? I think back to the 2021 election, and it was in July, after the floods in Western Germany, that Laschet and the CDU just tanked and the SPD kind of went up. But then for the last 2 months, or certainly the last weeks of the campaign, it seemed that preferences were pretty locked in. So just a question about what you think might happen, or if there is a trend in Germany that the polls might start moving in that final stretch.
Yeah, we can see that there is still stagnation in the polls, and with the AfD Merz drama, so we finally found a topic in this campaign, and but what the voters now see, and this is what I said in my slides, what they now see is that democratic parties fight each other instead of discussing topics, and I think there will be. The topic is there will be new rules for cooperation, and so what we hear now is that the FDP rules out a cooperation with the Greens, Markus Söder rules out a cooperation with the Greens. So it's what is discussed now is fighting each other, and really rarely any key issues.
Well, I mean, looking back at previous elections, it always depends on the perspective. If you compare the results 6 months before the election with the election outcome, the changes were rather minor. So the bigger changes at the end of the campaign were rather an exception than the rule, as you mentioned. But I'm not so sure this year, because after what happened last week, and with some debates to come, I would always rather rule out major effects those debates, and as the figures are well known. So there might be some more variation at the end of the campaign this year, or there's much more uncertainty, I would say, than in previous campaigns.
But we have only 2 weeks left. That we have to take into account. We have only 2 weeks left, and 2021 there started a movement while the Greens and the CDU make mistakes, and the SPD could profit from that. And so now we thought that Merz, I thought last week that Merz made the mistake, and you see nothing is moving in the polls. So I don't think if there is that there will be so much shifting from now on.
Okay, next we have a question about young voters, say under the age of 30 or under the age of 34. It is true that the Greens and the FDP did very well with this voting demographic back in 2021, but who are younger people tending towards? I think that I recall that in some of the Eastern elections last year, that the AfD actually made some major inroads with younger voters. So anyway, are there any clear trends or preferences for that demographic?
So what we can see that the FDP is not longer profiting from the youngs like 2021, but the Greens, most of the young voters tend to the Greens, and the AfD is. But you have to only look in 2 different parts in Germany. So that's the point. So the Greens will not have big efforts in the eastern part of Germany. But as we see that especially Habeck is good rated by young people in the West. And the AfD, if you say the AfD, the young voters tend to vote AfD, you have to take into account that there is also education bias by this. So you have to, the higher educated young voters do not vote for the AfD. It's the voters with lower education status. But the SPD is no longer is good rated by younger voters, not like in 2021. But Merz has, of course, a problem with young voters, as Peter also said.
Yeah, I think it also depends a little bit if you look at the eligible voters or the voters. So it's always interesting to look at the so-called repräsentative Wahlstatistik, so the statistics about the election published very lately after elections. I think the European elections are now published. I haven't had a look at it, but it will be interesting how this turns out this year, as the former catch-all parties did very bad in 2021 about among the younger people, but there are always some exaggerations in the media. I think when talking about the generation Greta Thunberg and so on, Greens were backed by the young people with higher education, more the female vote, and the liberals more by the younger men and so on. So it's not all overall, and they haven't turned all to the AfD either. So it will be interesting to see what the outcome will be.
All right, now we have a couple of questions about the, I guess, bigger picture systemic issues and where you see the German party system heading. Somebody asked if we are returning to the relationships last kind of witnessed under Weimar. There's another question about whether Germany is approaching an Austrian party system model, or whether it's Europeanizing in the sense that you have a Western and a post-socialist subsystem. So any thoughts on where you think the party system is headed?
So I think Olaf Scholz made the scenario of an Austrian scenario, but we have to take into account that in Austria, Kickel, for example, is no new politician, and the FPÖ is in charge for 20 years in state elections. So I don't think that we now or in 5 years, in 10 years, go into an Austrian scenario. This will not be happening, but it's the task of the democratic parties to not fight against each other, to fight against the AfD, and this have to be clear. And so Olaf Scholz should not only draw now the moral finger and focus on democracy is in danger with Merz. So this does not help, I think.
I would just add that I think will be crucial exactly what the democratic parties of the center, how they are going to behave, but especially how the CDU and CSU is going to behave, because if they refrain from doing what they did last week, and if they really stand against the extreme right, and the consensus can be built again among the democratic parties, then I think the system can be maintained, and the AfD can be contained. But if this really should break, if the major party of the party system, which is one of the last remaining Volksparteien in Europe, with its strength, is going weak on this issue, we will get a problem in the whole party system, I think.
All right, there's also a question, and I wanted to ask this as well. I think one of you showed data that, was it about 40% of the electorate is still undecided? So I'm wondering, is that a much larger share compared to previous electoral cycles? And what do we know about these voters? Do we have any idea if they're going to actually stay away from the polls? If they do decide kind of last minute, if they're going to kind of break one way or the other? I remember one of the more surprising things from the last US election here is that a lot of last minute deciders broke for Trump and Republicans. So do you have any sense on what's going on with this sizable group of voters?
I mean, this group of undecided is always a very tricky one, depending a little bit on what you look at. I mean, if you look at those people who won't tell us which party they prefer, or they don't know, or they don't know whether they were going to vote, and so on, it's a little bit hard to measure, because we do not really know what is going to happen. What we saw in previous elections was that most of those undecided or don't know respondents probably did not turn out after all. But what is clear, I think, is that there's not so much movement between the parties usually at the end of the campaign, but it's more a matter of mobilization. We had an interesting finding 3 years ago with the regional election in North Rhine-Westphalia, when the CDU with Wüst as a candidate, they won exactly the same number of votes as in the previous general election, but it was a disaster in the general election given the higher turnout. But he won easily in the regional election. Why? Because the SPD lost more than 1 million votes. So I would say it's much more about turnout and mobilization of the own supporters than of, winning over voters from other parties in the very last weeks of the campaign, usually.
All right, well, we're rapidly running out of time, so we maybe have time for 2 more questions. Here's an interesting question. So it's well known that the Christian Democrats get advice from Allensbach, one of, I guess, both of your competitors. Who are the other parties talking to? And in particular, does the AfD have a pollster that they get advice from?
I think this is a really delicate question. And I know that every party is talking to a lot of pollsters, but I don't know if with whom the AfD is talking. Probably with INSA, but this is a rumor, I heard. This is only a rumor, I don't know exactly. But they're not talking to us, and we're not talking to them. This is clear.
Yeah. So do we? I mean, we always had a rule to talk to any Democratic Party, but without talking to any of the extremist parties. So this was a clear policy, of course. But yeah, I think INSA, the connection of INSA and the AfD, I think former party gatherings, they mentioned it publicly that they got data from INSA in the meeting, so at least there was a connection. But apart from this, I'm not aware either who they're working with.
All right, so I guess we'll just go for one more question, and maybe we'll return back to the kind of issue of migration. Why do you think that the German political discourse is so focused on migration when this isn't a major concern for a lot of voters, according to your own polling? But also, especially Yvonne, I saw that in your Politbarometer, those Germans who said that migration was an important issue spiked in late January, and it became the most important issue that they thought in Germany. Yet then when you simultaneously asked, well, what is the most important issue for your vote, migration was way down on both of your in both of your polls. So, I mean, what accounts for this kind of bizarre discrepancy between what people are saying is an important issue and then the issue that's actually going to affect their votes? And then related to that, why is the public discourse so focused on migration?
So this is historical. So we welcomed millions of refugees, and migration is since 2016 such a big issue in Germany. And now we had to be clear that the migration is also a problem for Germany, and a majority in Germany is really supported the idea of Friedrich Merz, but not the cooperation with Friedrich Merz. But the idea is really supported by a clear majority, even under SPD supporters. And so migration and the economy, the bad economy situation, are really big issues in the society, and they cause a lot of uncertainty. That's the point. And yeah, and it's especially AfD voters mention that this is the most impact for voting. But it is really every day in the media, and it's really a main topic and a key topic in our society, because we are in Europe the country with the most, who welcomed the most refugees, and now we we have to deal with it. And now we have to know now that integration of everyone is not possible, and it causes a lot of it costs a lot of money, and it causes a lot of social problems, and that's why it's a key issue.
Peter, some final thoughts?
Yeah, I do agree. The problem is that for any party apart from the AfD, it's a very tricky issue. I mean, if you talk to politicians from other parties, they will tell you that it's a very delicate issue because it depends on how you play it and on what you're stressing. And as it is an emotional issue to many people, it's very difficult to draw the line between your party and the AfD when you say that you want to limit migration, but you want to do it in a democratic manner. So it's quite difficult, but the only thing we know is that the way Merz did it was rather problematic even for his party, because it woke up some ghosts he probably won't like in the end.
All right, well, we have come full time now. Let me thank both of you one more time for taking the time out of your busy schedule to share your expertise and insights with us. I found this to be quite illuminating, and certainly there will be a lot to observe over the next couple of weeks before the Bundestag election on February 23rd. And thank you to all of our attendees for taking time to listen to us today. Goodbye.